Welcome to Documenting the Danger Zone. I think some of you may have been at the excellent session before, This Film Can Save Your Life, about preparing to go and make films in dangerous places. This is about being in dangerous places and making films, and both staying safe and getting the film back home and completing it. I've got an excellent panel, starting on my left with Evan Williams, who is an Australian, but we won't hold that against him. He's been making films for the ABC and Channel 4. He's covered stories all over the world, including Burma, Zimbabwe, Papua, Middle East, Southeast, Central Asia, and more recently, Nigeria's Hidden War. I think, was it the first film from your company?
Yes.
Yes.
The first big one, yep.
Absolutely, which I seem to remember it winning an award.
Won the Broadcast Award for Best News and Current Affairs this year. Yep.
Not a bad start.
Yeah,
not a bad start to a company.
Thanks for it.
And Ramita Navai is an Emmy Award-winning journalist. She's reported from over 30 countries, made 20 docs for Unreported, and she's the former Tehran correspondent of The Times, and also an award-winning author, which her debut book, The City of Lies, Love, Sex and Death, and the Search for Truth in Tehran. It's quite a long title.
I got sex in there, though.
Yeah, true. Won the debut political book of the year at the Political Book Awards, so another award winner. And Chris Lawton, who, after serving the British Army, went into security, has advised the UN and NGO sector, and then moved to BBC High Risk, worked in BBC High Risk for some time, and is now setting up a high-risk team for Bloomberg. So an excellent panel. What we're going to do is we're going to show clips. All these guys have brought along clips. We've got a couple of clips each. And so we'll have a look at the clip, and then we'll talk about some of the issues that those clips raise. And we'll, by all means, if anyone's got a question, then just stick your hand up, and we'll try and integrate that as we go along. So, Evan, that's Western Papua New Guinea, where it's very, very difficult to operate as a journalist. You're undercover. You're working under the radar. And then that happens. Is that how far into the shoot was that?
Yeah, that was, I think you'd officially call that a real problem. That was basically hours after we had arrived. That was the first night of the actual filming, first day, really. That was our first meeting. And I wanted to show that because a number of things happened, but it's a very simple example of something that can go wrong and what you need to plan for, really. So it's about that situation there was we arrived, the meeting was arranged way ahead, as we said. They'd gone to great trouble and risk to come and see us. What happened there was obviously somebody in the local area either knew about the meeting or saw us arrive. They were an informer for the police or for the authorities, and then the police turned up. Now, the police in that situation were in the area, but were far enough away to allow the people to escape. It was a really tense situation. Had they all been caught, they would have been interrogated, possibly jailed. We would have been stopped from filming immediately and probably deported. And the reason I wanted to show it was to think about, and forgive me because I'm sure all of you are very experienced and know all this, but just this is the example I wanted to share. It's what happens when things go wrong that you didn't expect at all. And had we been arrested, that would have been the end of the shoot. We would have been, had no capacity to continue. So what that then brought about was plan B, which was to lay low and to take that very, very seriously, to have a plan B to basically either stop filming or get out of town, go to a different town, change the way you're operating, do something differently, and have that already planned. And we did have a plan. We had a safe house to go to. We made sure everybody was okay, they'd got away, and we did lay low. And in fact, we left that town for a couple of days and then came back and continued filming afterwards. But it's just an example of how to think about things that can go wrong.
So later on in the film, you talk to someone who's described as one of the country's most wanted men. He talks about the fact that they have previously taken foreign journalists hostage to draw attention to their plight. Yep. How do you navigate that?
Well, that was interesting because that night I later found out that they were talking late into the night. Our main communication and contact to the people were tribal elders from the Highland community. So they weren't journalistic fixers. They were men of standing within that dissident community. And he took us up there. He was our contact, and it was all about his honour and his contact and what he was trying to get out. So he was the contact with the rest of the world. The guerrilla leader, the man that was actually in charge of the OPM section of that community, had taken people in the past, and apparently, to my later knowledge, was discussing whether he should keep us that evening. And I could see them, I could hear them going on in the background for quite some time, and I thought, well, it's probably tribal business and it's all fine, and you know, we'll be fine. But later on I found out there was a serious discussion about whether it would be more impactful to keep us for a while. And our tribal contact said, you can't do that because we've arranged this, it was months in the planning, we think the message is best if you just let these guys tell the story.
I remember being talking to a general in an oblast that had previously been closed to outsiders, and we were supposedly the first journalists, and we were taken to see the general in charge of the oblast. And we were sort of sat at one end of the table, he was at the other end of the table, and they were chatting away in Russian, and I kept saying to the fixer, what are they saying? And the fixer would say, you don't want to know. And eventually we got outside, you know, we were inspected and allowed to leave, and we got into the car, and there was one point where they all laughed, and I said to the fixer once we were in the car, so what that point where everyone laughed, what was all that about? If you won't tell me the whole conversation, what was that about? He said, oh, he was just saying how the last time he met journalists, he was just about to torture them.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice,
yeah.
nice man.
Exactly.
Chris, as a security specialist, sorry, just to clarify, that was you and Siobhan.
Yes.
So you didn't have security with you, it was just
No.
the two of you. Okay.
Yeah, it was an undercover. We had a cover story, we were tourists, we were pretending we were a couple on holiday, and there was a couple of major cultural events that we basically had the trip focused on to give us some cover. And that was the way we did it. But yeah, security wouldn't have worked in that situation.
As a security specialist,
Yeah.
then in a situation, had you been there, and you know that this guerrilla leader has previously taken hostages, how do you assess that?
I think you've got to acknowledge it's there, and it's something that could happen. And what I'd say is something worked well because your warning came in and you were able to clear off, and that's fantastic. I mean, that's a great result, and you've got your plan B in place. What I'd be interested in that kind of circumstances is what you can do to control the interview, what you can do to control the location, because I think often we see ourselves as passive participants. You know, you're asked to go somewhere and you just turn up and you just do what you're told. It doesn't have to be like that. You know, you can't influence a great deal, but there are things you can influence. You know, like that trigger that someone is coming and you need to get out. Is that something that, you know, you set up yourself? Or is it something that they've set up and you had in place, or that they had in place inherently?
Yeah, in that particular situation, they had people in the area watching.
Yeah.
So when that call came through, it was from somebody out on the street that was watching the area because they knew this could be a possibility. It's an occupied country. The police, you know, are a problem for them whenever they have any activity like that. So that was their warning system.
Yeah.
And we knew there was a warning system in place. We just didn't expect it to actually happen on the first night.
Yeah. I mean, and the fact that warning system's in place is it's a huge factor. You know, and you combine that with other things you can set up. You know, like, what is your withdrawal route? Do you have a car and a vehicle and a driver, and where are they, and can you get to them? Identifying where that threat is most likely to come from. And those are all things that they had inherently. These are also things that, you know, as a security advisor, and like, I don't think me being there, or any security advisor being there, is going to make a great deal of difference. But in that phase where you're thinking about these things, that's something that people can generate internally and control yourself. Another thing, Brian, that we'd look at if there was, you know, if the people I was interviewing were in question, is what can we do to control the location and change the location? You know, they might give you a place and you might not like the place. You know, it might be well in their heartland. It might be the only place they meet you, in which case if you take the pill, you take the pill and that's great, which is probably what you guys did. But can you influence that? Can you change that a few minutes beforehand so that if they're looking to take you hostage, you know, they'll have things in place to do that. You know, they'll have a team to do it, likely to anyway. You know, you change the location at the last minute and they're willing to do that. You know, that takes away their planning if they're looking to do things like that. So, you know, someone being there is not the right thing to do always. But there are things that, you know, we would look to influence at a very early stage in terms of controlling the location, the people, the communications and the movement. And that's where kind of, I think our influence can come in. And you guys can take it or leave it. It's like a menu, you know. don't like that, I do like that, and adapt it to your situation. So that's where we'd sit on it.
So, I mean, that raises an interesting point. You say you guys can take it or leave it. So if when you are in country, when you're there as the security advisor, how does it work in terms of your relationship? You've got, say in this case, you've got a reporter and you've got a shooting director. And so if there's just three of you, which is often the case when Unreported World does have security, it's usually just the three of them or a local fixer. At what point do you sort of say, with my security hat on, I'm just saying no? Yeah. Or is it always just a negotiation and a discussion?
For me, it's 95% of the time it's a negotiation. And if people want to do things, they're going to do them. We just try and help you to get where you want to be and influencing what practices around it. And also understanding, how high the risk threshold is. It's so people aren't going into situations blindly, like, you got the risk there, and it worked, your plans worked, and that's great, and you understood it. We just make sure people know that. So if there is no backup, if there is nothing you can do, then honestly, provided that's okay with your bosses, with you, that's fine with me. But it's making sure you know it. And what we can do, we will do. But it's just making sure we're not doing these things blindly. And how do you put that across? You've got to choose your moment, and if you can't, but you can't always do that, and sometimes you can't. And that, I think we'll probably see it in one of my clips later. Sometimes you miss that opportunity, and then when something does happen, it ain't right. But where you can have the interjections specifically on the spot, it can make a real difference. But ideally, even if I was there, I wouldn't like to have said anything in that scenario. I'd just like it to have worked, because we've had that conversation a day prior, the night prior. But, things do just happen on the spot sometimes as well, and that's when the adaptability comes in and the flexibility.
So, Ramita, Evan, have you ever been in situations where you've had a security person there and they've said, no, I really don't think we should do this, and there's been tension?
I've never worked with security in the field, ever actually. And I've heard that's a good thing. Because I've heard that you often do stop us. I mean, certainly when journalists speak among themselves, Ev, don't you find this? Like, especially places like Afghanistan, they feel quite hemmed in and contained. And they feel that you don't understand, that there are certain places that they can go. I think certainly for me, working in the Middle East, especially places like Afghanistan, I do feel it's a little bit different. And I think there are different rules for me because I speak the language. I look like I'm one of them. So sometimes it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, you build up a good team with security. I've worked with security mainly in Iraq, and I've always found it, when we've had it, I've always found it incredibly useful. Mainly because we've tapped into local. There's often there's been a foreigner sort of chief of operations, but then a team of locals, and you're tapping into extremely deep local knowledge, which we simply don't have. And if it's a changing situation and we're being asked to go to a certain place, how do I know how to properly assess what the danger level is? In one situation we were filming, there was a producer in London who was finding material and wanting us to go to a certain place. We used half the team to go and assess that the day before we were meant to go and film. He came back and said, well, we can go, but it's basically Al-Qaeda controlled, and there's no police, and there's nobody except them, and it's one road in, one road out. I would advise we don't go, but if you really want to go, we can, and that's information I wouldn't have been able to achieve without that local knowledge.
Oh yeah, actually, information-wise in Afghanistan, it has been invaluable to know, because roads as well change day to day. Yeah. So when we were travelling to Badakhshan in the north of the country, we absolutely listened, and I listen always. If a security guy does say, I know that they're really experienced, and they're used to taking risks. So if they say no, I'm not going to take that risk.
And I think that decision-making question is a really interesting one as well, especially as we've become very security conscious as an industry and as across society. And I think there's the tactical question. Do we go down that street? Well, actually, I don't like it because of the track record of what's happened there. The people we know are in that building. we're not going down there. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is editorial decision making. You know, that's not my job. You know, in terms of going to towns or areas or pursuing certain stories, you know, it's just not the place of the security advisor to say no on that.
But it does lead to interesting conversations because it does become editorial in a way. Like if you say we can't go to a place, then that does change. Because in many ways we're being asked to go there to get the story. And then it's a matter of, well, how can we do it? Rather than not doing it at all, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we could say what we think about the security situation there with authority. The decision to do it or not is not ours. I don't have to go.
Yeah.
You know, we're an advisory body.
Yeah.
And I think that's a key distinction.
Okay, let's move on to the next clip, which is Ramita's film Undercover Syria. That's an incredibly tense piece of footage. Was that as terrifying as it looked?
Yeah, it was actually. And I'll tell you why it was particularly terrifying. So we'd spent, it was 3 days in that safe house, whispering because they were so scared. It's when the locals are scared that you know that it's not looking good, especially guys like that. And at this point, they were getting there. They joined the Free Syrian Army pretty soon after that. And Abu Ja'far is now dead. The others are missing. After that raid, 12 guys are missing, are presumed dead. We know that they were taken to prison, and there were reports that they were tortured. So what was really frightening is that we'd become really close with these guys. We got to know them really well, 3 days stuck in this safe house. And if they had, we knew that if our house had got raided and they had been caught, we'd never see them again. So it was really, Wael Dabus filmed it. Wael and I sat facing the door. Actually, we held hands. That's how scared we were. And we were talking about what are we going to do so we don't get them, how do we get them away from this cupboard? So how are we going to protect these guys? And also that's a situation where they'd picked this safe house because it had 2 back exits. So all the safe houses, they'd really put thought into this. All the safe houses that those activists picked had an escape route, right? So this had 2 windows, and from both windows you could jump onto the roofs of other buildings. But our house was surrounded by the Shabiha, by armed militia. So there was no escape route, they couldn't get out. So all their plans as well had gone to shit. So we were extremely lucky. We heard them in the building, and we heard them smashing glasses, beating people, we heard boots, hundreds of boots trudge up the road. So we were just very lucky.
And they just never knocked on the door?
Yeah, they were in the building, and they don't knock. They're not that polite. That's why we were sitting there with our British passports, ready to start shouting English, which is what the guys had told us to do. They were like, you've got to let them know you're not Syrian. And that's another thing that I think was discussed in the last panel, but which is so important. You know the risks that you're taking when you do this job. But, we have a duty of care. These are big guys, and they later went on to fight, and they knew the risks they were taking as well. But I still felt that duty of care. They were in this position because they wanted to document what was happening, but through us. So a lot of this had been arranged because of us.
What stage of the Syrian war was that?
So I think the uprising began in February. So Homs had been, they were bombing Homs at that stage, but Homs had been bombed. But nobody really knew what was happening in the rest of the country. And this was, I think, August.
About 6 months.
Oh, yeah. So actually, I should bring Evan into this because he felt like a lifeline. When we were in that house, Ev, you got a call from me. We didn't know what to do, and we really thought this is it. And of course, you don't want to phone, especially in Syria. We were being really careful not phoning in case we were monitored. You know, we'd got there through a complete fluke. We'd got there really luckily because the embassy was Googling everybody. And we got there on tourist visas. A contact of mine had told me that the embassy Googler was away for 24 hours, and that's how we managed to get. Yeah, it's an incredible story.
Don't say that.
Oh God, he's probably dead now. Yeah. So yeah, a long time ago. So we were very careful about being monitored. You know, probably overcautious, which you have to be. So we really did avoid making contact, unnecessary contact with London. But when that happened, Evan got, was it a hysterical phone call? What was it?
Breathless.
Yeah.
But understandably, yeah, no, you were great.
How far in was that you were able to make contact with them?
It was 4 in the morning.
In those 3, but it was in those 3 days.
Weren't you on the RAS?
I was in bed. It was at the end of the 3 days. No, it was as that was happening.
Yeah.
When they were, I could hear what Ramita could hear and Wal could hear. I could hear on the phone. I could hear the militia on the street. So I knew they were very close. And basically the plan was. I mean, I was only doing it as a deputy on the program at the time. So the plan was just declare who you are and what you're doing, because at that point that was the safest option, rather than them thinking you could be something else, foreign spies, or which is what I want to get onto later. That people will assume that you're not journalists, and that's even more dangerous.
And that was the beginning of the shoot. So we'd arrived in Damascus, and we spent a few days sightseeing, being very careful, and then we were waiting for a phone call. And when we got the phone call, and the activists were extremely careful as well. They didn't talk on the phone. It was all coded, and this had been organised beforehand. We spent, months setting this up. When we got the phone call, we then got to Madaya, which is near the border with Lebanon, outside Damascus. We drove there. So Wal and I were operating together as a couple undercover. I drove. We hired a car, and. We looked the part. We looked like a Middle Eastern, like rich Lebanese couple, and we got to a safe house in Madaya. Nothing much was happening in Madaya. It just happened to be where our contacts in London, the activists that we kind of hooked up with, kind of knew people working in Madaya at the time, and it was a pretty quiet place. And of course, half an hour into this meeting, they'd got all of the activists in Madaya. It was an evening. We got there in the evening, and we were sitting round. They all started to talk. We were sitting around in the living room. They were telling me all their stories, and all of a sudden, they started running. They started running. Everybody disappeared. They bundled us into a car and took us to this safe house, because they'd got word that from lookouts, they had lookouts all over, that the police were on their way, that the government forces were on their way.
I think one of the extraordinary things with pieces like that is that you see things that you just wouldn't see unless people take that level of risk. Because you can talk about detention and people being kidnapped and killed, but until it's witnessed like that, you don't see it, you don't understand what it really is, the sort of raw emotion of it. And going with that from a risk perspective, and and liaising with people and journalists who do this, you kind of, once you go that far, you go with those guys. There's not a great deal else that can be done. You're there, and then it's what you have in place, and it has to work, and things like that can happen, and you were really, really lucky.
Yeah.
But what can you do? You can put your call out to London. You can start leaving your trail of breadcrumbs, which, I don't know if that's why you did it, but you might have just been reaching out for a bit of emotional support, which is often what people need as well. They just want someone to say, what can I do? I just want to talk to you now, because they can be in a situation like that or under fire, which is another key thing that you have to do and absorb when you're working in these environments. But it's also the right thing to do, because, looking at that, I think you're going somewhere. I think you're going to be going with those Shabir here, and I think you're going to go to Damascus. But at least we know where to start. Because if we have to set up, or, some kind of crisis management team or incident management teams going in place, start working out, how do we get this person back? You know, it's happened. How do we get them back? At least we've got a starting point. It ain't perfect. You know, it's not helicopters flying in and plucking you out with a dozen armed men, but it's a start, you know, and it gives us a tree to start shaking. And that kind of thing can be invaluable, you know, in that kind of scenario. So, you know.
That was the reason for Ramita's call. In fact, I mean, the plan was, I mean, we had a plan in place where, you know, if anything like this happened, then obviously the first thing you do is you have a plan where you do let people know where you are and what's the last point of contact, and that would have certainly been it. And then the plan would have been, of course, well, to make it official, they've declared their journalists, we know they've been taken by Shabiha in this town at that time, and then it would have been an embassy issue, and we would have, you know, the whole train would have then kicked into place. So it maybe was a little bit emotional, but there's nothing I could have said. I think I might have even said, just act like a stupid tourist. You're probably pretty good at that, Ramita, to try and lighten the moment. And she didn't laugh, but you know, like, you know, that was the plan, sort of thing, you know. And but there was a serious side to it, which was let people know where you are if you can. And it's often forgotten by people when they're in the field in a tense situation.
Yeah.
If you haven't thought through a plan beforehand about when things go wrong, then that can happen, and you're taken without making that call.
Okay, so we're going to stay in the Middle East. We're going to go from Syria to Iraq, and we're going to see a news piece that Chris was involved in setting up. This is from Struggle for Iraq. So, Chris, that's the same location a couple of days apart, from the beginning to the first parts of the piece to camera at the end.
Yeah.
So clearly it's a very, very fluid and fast-changing situation. How do you assess risk when it's all changing so quickly?
Yeah, which is why I chose that piece, because, you know, we got into Kurdistan at the time when ISIS were basically sweeping into Iraq, and the Kurds took this opportunity to seize their homeland, and then they set out to defend it. And, you know, this is the story that people wanted, so, you know, that was the brief, go and get it. So off we go, and we went down to this place called Jalula, where the Kurds were actively fighting ISIS at that time. Now, the first thing you want is information, you know, what's going on there, and we had a really inaccurate picture because it was so fluid. So the first real kind of good fix I got was actually on the way down, about sort of 6 hours before we arrived, and we saw a journalist coming out. And you saw the footage there spread over the week, you know, where it's very active, a lot of fighting going on. And this journalist coming out was telling how he'd been penned into a basement with ISIS on 3 sides, and he'd made that phone call out as well, thinking that, you know, that was pretty much it for him, and it hadn't been in the end. And that's what we thought we were going in for. But then when we got there, we found a very, very different environment. And I've got a quote from Fergal. He says, "Oh, the quiet streets of war, I hate them. Fear echoes and multiplies in the silence." And it shifted. We'd gone from this very kinetic, active scenario, which is actually, in a way, quite understandable, because bullets and bombs are quite tangible, into something where the threat was silent. You know, it was more focused around the human terrain. So it was a population that wasn't Kurdish, it was Sunni Arab. It was a slightly more natural operating environment for ISIS than working amongst a Kurdish population, for example. And then the grammar of that conflict changes. And this is the kind of thing that we try and interpret, you know, and having been sort of focused in Afghanistan, in places like that over the past, you kind of start buying into this, you know, but what are the indicators of something going to happen? And you can almost feel the swell of people and movement around you, you know, the guy on the street corner in the otherwise deserted street, the lone vehicle. And so my sort of key interjections with the team there were, first of all, when we first get to this patrol base and we're going forward into Jalula, and there we think we're going into a very kinetic environment. And that's one of the, you know, it's almost like giving a very quick set of instructions. You know, if you get fired on from the right, do this, from the left, do this. If there's an IED, this is what we're going to do. It's quite easy, it's quite straightforward in a way with trained people. But then when we got there, I suddenly had to change all that, because then, you know, you're looking at the atmospherics around you. And one of the things there that happened, for example, was just after that piece to camera you saw, which finished the piece, we were with a commander, we were with the Kurdish forces, and again, it's one of those situations where you're with them, you've got to go with them, because there are guides there and they're controlling that environment. He wanted to go and see his men in his most forward post and show them to us, you know, show us his hard-bitten fighters and show what a great commander he was. So we have to go. It's a deserted street. We go past the point where I know someone 24 hours earlier has been hemmed in on 3 sides, you know, and a kind of a quick attack that was put on them. And then we're put into this patrol base, and we lose all visibility of what's going on around us, so effectively we're blind in that environment. The only guy I saw on that street was a single shopkeeper, and it was the only shop open, where he could directly see the entrance to that base where we were. So quickly you're thinking, okay, that guy, not likely, not probably, but he may be passing information on to this enemy that is moving around us, the enemy of the curves, that is, that's moving around us. And there you start counting the clock, because you can almost feel things moving around you that you can't see. And so here you are with this commander trying to do an interview. He wants you to film all his men. He wants to give you tea. So you're trying to do as much as you can to be as polite as possible, but also get out there as quickly as you can. And it's a key relationship. So, you know, these journalists don't want to harm that relationship, but I want to get us out of there. So that's where, you know, I step in and start trying to hasten things up and shorten the time that we have there, you know, and actively introduce things like time limits, 2 minutes, 5 minutes before we've got to go, and make sure everyone understands that. And then you push out again, and there it's just a question of, you know, time and how fast you can leave, and if you're lucky or not. So it's that, I kind of wanted to put that piece in there because it just highlights the fluidity and the changing grammar of the threat in an area that's almost become quite commonplace to work now. And I just thought that was a really important little area to highlight.
Time's a really important one, as you say. I mean, actually, before going into any situation like that, I mean, now, as you all probably know, you know, really seriously think about the time you're going to spend in that environment. So is it 20 minutes? Is it 15 minutes? Is it actually 5 minutes? Are you going to be on the street? How long are you going to be there? And to think through before you go into film, to actually, importantly, discuss it through with the PD and the fixer and the translator, what it is you're going to achieve in that time, because time goes really quickly, and you find you've done the interview but you've got no other shots, or you've got the shots and not the interview, and, you know, you've got to have that planned out before you go in.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so we're going to go to another one of your clips now. We're going to cross the ocean and go to Guatemala, City of the Dead. Again, we'll have a look at the clip first and then talk about it.
Mine.
Sorry, it's one of yours, isn't it? Yes.
It's all right. We often get mixed up.
There are so many extraordinary lines in that clip. I'm actually feeling quite scared now. There's one of them.
Well, actually,
but also
our director, Sam Farmer, had a very different reaction to me. He said, I think we'll just be shot at. He was, he was very calm. He was quite frighteningly calm. So I tell you why I picked that. So that was the second piece of work that I'd done for TV. So at that point, I'd been a print journalist and I'd worked in the Middle East. So, you know, I'd gone to Afghanistan, Pakistan, you know, been working as the correspondent in Tehran, but I'd gone to kind of places where there were conflict. But Latin America, and it continues to be, for me, the most violent place. It's just indiscriminate violence. It's a real culture of violence. And I feel far more exposed and scared when I'm in Latin America than I do, even now, in parts of the Middle East. And I would do things differently. So for me, this was a really interesting lesson. We had an amazing fixer who became a very, very good friend, Juan Carlos Yorca, and he was a great journalist. But there definitely wasn't enough communication as far as kind of culturally understanding each other. He'd grown up in Guatemala, and he hadn't really worked with Western crews before. He'd worked with Western journalists who'd been based there and kind of knew the score and understood his language. His English is brilliant, and I'll tell you why I say I'm kind of language and Western journalist. Because when I would ask him, you know, when we went to that area, for example, is this area dangerous? What are we doing? I think that was the second day of filming. No, it's not that dangerous. For him, not that dangerous means you could get shot at. You know, for him, not that dangerous means you don't stop the car and get out, because you could be stopped at gunpoint, which did happen to us as well, actually. Sam, a week into shooting, in the middle of Guatemala City, in a place, again, that was actually, it was deemed to be safe, he got a gun shoved in his stomach, and he was held up. So it's understanding, you know, I do it differently now. you know, I sit down and I try and understand what does that mean, what does it mean not that dangerous in this country? You know, and I had backpacked around Guatemala. Actually, it was the end of the Civil War when I did, but we were on the tourist trail, probably like people here, seemed completely safe. And of course, somewhere like Guatemala, it's a matter of streets. Gee, you can be in one street and be safe, and the next road along, you will not be safe. And Juan Carlos hadn't told us, because he, you know, for him this was so every day, but people had been killed, a car full of people had been killed in that area, and they had got killed when they were shot at by the same people a few months before us. So that was a lesson.
I think that understanding question, you know, that's certainly something that I always look for, and as a security advisor, you know, we can help people with that, but, you know, that one of the things we look for on the level of influence that we have and involvement that we have is how much does that exist, you know, and do we need to guide that person towards getting some more, or is it something we can actively help with? Because there's things I understand very well. You know, we get certain environments and we get certain situations, but we don't get them all by any means. But one of the things we can provide for people is just to test or look at how much are they asking the right questions. Are they, you know, and it can be hard won. It can be really hard won. But you know, that's quite phenomenal, amazing clip.
I think, am I right in saying that you witnessed 6 deaths in a 24-hour period in that?
Yeah.
Shoot. So this is your
someone died at my feet, actually.
So this is your second film?
Yeah.
And you experienced that. What kind of effect does that have on you?
God, that's a big question. What effect? I like to think I haven't become inured to that kind of thing. I don't think I have. Did it toughen me up? No, not really. Thank God. I haven't become one of those war-ravaged, oh, I just shot my leg off, reporters. No.
And, I mean, the same question for you, really, Chris. It's thinking about the welfare of crews after they've been through essentially a traumatic experience. You know, seeing 6 people, someone dying at your feet, is a highly traumatic experience.
Yes.
How do you mitigate the risk of PTSD?
You can't get rid of it. You know, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And it does happen. Happens an awful lot. And one of the things I feel really strongly about is some of the big organisations, the BBC, that are looking at this. Others are as well. We are at Bloomberg too. Are we doing enough? And especially for independent filmmakers and freelancers, what is out there to back you guys up? What can you do? Because, you know, you can't reduce the risk, and you might be fine one day, you might be fine in one place, but then something else might happen in another, and all of a sudden you're not fine. There are structures out there, there's an awful lot out there, so we're looking at something called trauma risk management, and it's something that we got very good at in the army, funny old thing, and the army got really good at it, and it was a kickback against the macho culture that everything's okay all the time, and if you're having problems then you're weak. You know, because that ain't true. And there are things you can do to monitor that, to find out if you're all right, and to capture it, and to get it treated early if you need to. And a lot of it's very simple. A lot of it's based just around a conversation with a friend or a colleague. But do they know what the signs are? Do they know what the symptoms are? Do they know if something's happening out of the ordinary? You know, when does that conversation take place? You know, so within our mechanism, for example, we try and get something in there quickly. You know, if someone is identified as suffering something potentially traumatic to them, it isn't necessarily being in a firefight or seeing someone killed. It could be if you've never been in a car crash before, but everyone's okay, that's still traumatic. You know, there's no set thing. But, you know, getting those mechanisms in place. Within an organisation, it's quite easy. It's a difficult thing to say no to. But, you know, do you have the support mechanisms in place, the peer-based network, the friends, and is enough being done in the independent filmmaking industry and amongst freelancers to make that stuff accessible? Because I don't think we can ignore it. I think there's an astonishing percentage of people who are actually probably affected by it. And, You know, one of the preparation questions, you know, I should have asked about this in the risk assessment, isn't just preparing for when things go bad, it's preparing for after things have gone bad and down the line and looking after yourself. But, you know, I feel very strongly that these things do need to be set up, and they do exist. Trauma management is out there.
Unreported World actually would always offer counselling if I wanted it after a film. And I think commissioning, certainly Siobhan at Channel 4 is very aware of the effects that these things can have. So I definitely felt that there was support if I needed it, and have always felt that. Yeah, as a freelancer working for Channel 4, I've never worked for the BBC, but yeah, it's important.
Do you think you would know if you needed it?
I think I have had post-traumatic stress, and you're right, you don't always know that you've got it. And sometimes it's just depression and you think it's kind of post-shoot kind of blues, anti-climax of going back to the office after you've experienced something like that. But yeah, now I know the signs. But I think I'm just one of those people, God, I'll probably have a breakdown now, but I think I'm just one of those people that's good at processing, and I'm really good at compartmentalizing. And it's funny though, because that's one of my earlier films, and I think if we watch the clip where the guy does die at my feet, I think now I'm more aware on camera that I've got to keep it together. Whereas, you know, you probably, I imagine, if I can't remember, but I think that I look really quite disturbed. And I think you can see me crying probably, but now I'm good at containing it now, which I think you have to do. And also you have to contain it for the people around you, which I've learnt as well, that you have to keep it together for contributors.
And I'd also say as well, you know, it's very, very normal to be upset by things. You know, that's certainly not, I think anyone looking at this, the traumatic stress, the PTSD question, there is you know, when you see and witness these things, which people do on a day-to-day basis, you know, it's very, very normal to be deeply upset by that. You know, there does come a point where that is affecting your life in a negative way, and it becomes not normal, you know, not a good thing. And that's what, you know, we need to spread the education about this amongst people who make these films, because counselling is often available, but the people who notice are your family, they're your friends, and they're your professional colleagues, and yourself, you know, so that's where this education needs to take place. I feel very strongly about that, but also accepting that it is entirely normal for things to affect you, because they do.
I actually feel quite relieved when I cry these days. Like, God, I'm still human, I'm still... Yeah.
I think also it has an aggregate effect. I think people, you see it in people, our colleagues, and you see it in yourself. I mean, you know, you go through one trauma or traumatic experience, it could just be tension, you know, that you don't then, if you don't process, if you don't deal with it in some way and recognise you've got to sit down, I often call it my sort of brick wall moment, you know, come home and just think through what actually happened there, and to give yourself space to actually allow yourself to think that through and work out what wasn't normal about it. And I find that helps a little bit. But you see it in people who go through moments. I think if they don't process it, it gets aggregate, and you see them taking more and more risks. I don't know if you see this with journalists.
Yeah.
People will go and take more and more risk, and they seem to forget, and I think it's obvious, but really important to remember that each dangerous situation is completely different from the last one. And you can't apply, you know, Iraq is different to Guatemala City, and you've got to assess those risks and that danger completely in a new way, with a new mind. And often for years I've seen people who just think they've been in war, they can go to Guatemala City, it's all going to be fine because they've been in a war. Well, it's not. And often that's when they get into trouble.
Yeah. I really relate to your point about crying. I remember finishing a very challenging film and finishing the edit, and had been working night after night, and got home, and my wife had recorded a programme I particularly wanted to watch, and so I sort of went to sit down and watch that programme, and it just so happened that there was something on the telly when I turned it on that was about Live Aid, and they were showing the Who's Going to Drive You Home film, which I'd seen before, and, you know, yes, it was very emotional. And I started watching this, you know, the music video of Who's Going to Drive You Home to the shots of the Ethiopian famine. And I just started sobbing and sobbing, and I just cried for 20 minutes or so, and it, as you say, it just felt great. It felt really like you were just washing out all that stuff you'd been holding for weeks.
I've started crying at all the soppy bits in the movies. Momentarily.
Momentarily. He hastily added.
It's all right, that's normal.
Oh, good.
Okay, we're going to go to the Cameroon. This is one of your films. Let's have a look at Monkey Business.
Right. I wanted to show that because it's not a war situation, but it's an example of how things can go wrong where you have no idea where they're going to come from or how they're going to go wrong. I mean, we organised that with that guy over days. He was prepared to talk to us and everything else. The problem was that the other men in the village heard that we were interviewing him, and they hunted us through. We'd gone to an area outside the village quite some way. The village had found out that this was going on. I think they'd seen us come through the village, and then the word went out. And then we were there. Then the men came to try and find us. And I think in the end we made sure he was fine, but it was all because there was a hunting village, and they thought that we were either part of some UN. This gets back to my earlier point. They don't always assume you're a journalist, and that's no protection. You know you're a journalist. There's a lot of suspicion among people in lots of situations that you're something else. They thought that we were there to expose that particular village, and that would have ended the hunting, which was very valuable to a lot of the hunters. So the men took it on themselves to try and find us. They were all armed with machetes. It was extremely difficult. We didn't record the actual moment because it was actually very, very tense. There was probably about 20 guys all scraping their pangas on the road, threatening him in particular and threatening us and surrounding us in a situation that could have turned very, very nasty. We were very isolated. And it was all because they thought we were going to close down the business. We managed to negotiate, we managed to make sure everybody was calmed down. We told them we weren't going to talk about specific locations, but it was a good example and a good lesson for me as well about how all of a sudden you've got everything in place, you think you've done the right thing, and all of a sudden 20 guys come out of the bush with machetes, and they'd be prepared to take you out as much as they would anybody else. So I just thought it was a useful example to think about things. And again, we had our vehicle, we had our car, we had our guy there, we were ready to go if we had to get out in a hurry. But it was very tense, and it can be a problem. So it's just a matter of thinking. It's not always about someone shooting at you, it can be something else.
How did word get out?
I don't know. I think there were women in the village who were either aware of the meeting with him or saw us driving through the village, because it was one road. It was almost like a village at the end of the world. It was really at the edge of the forest. One road in, and so strangers in a vehicle, what are they doing here? Go and get the lads.
Did they see
find
a
out.
camera when you went?
No, we didn't. As I said, we didn't record on the way in, but we were just strange, and somehow the word got out. And we found out when we calmed everybody down, it was all about the money. You know, they were like, "This is our business. This is how we need to make money. What are you doing?" And they were particularly angry with him for talking to us about the trade.
What happened to him?
He was fine. After we calmed everybody down, but it was difficult. You know, he was in real danger for a moment. So yeah.
You say one road in, one road out, and is that one of the things that you're looking at? Is one road in, one road out?
Yeah.
Bad idea.
No choice.
But
yeah,
no choice.
There was no choice. Yeah. That was the village. You had to go through the village to get to the part of the forest that we wanted to meet him in. Often I think we've done other things recently in Nigeria with that where you need to think about obviously contributor security as much as your own, and often that's more important than yours because they're the ones who are being left behind. Again, it sounds obvious, but it gets forgotten often. You get out, they're left there. So in Nigeria we spent a lot of time organising people. We moved them at least a 6-hour journey from their villages to another place where we interviewed them there, because being seen with a foreign crew would have been enough to cause them problems, if not arrest and torture. So in that situation, as much the editorial side was half the story, the logistics of keeping everybody safe was even more.
And did you go into the issue of viruses?
Yeah.
So what about those risks? Was that something you'd considered beforehand?
You mean in that situation?
Yeah.
Well, we decided not to eat any gorilla. No, but there was a moment where we were staying in a town in a small hut, and the lady that ran it, we came in and she said, "I've got lunch ready," and it was a monkey that she was actually on the fire, and we were like, "No, thanks very much," you know. So the viruses can only be transferred usually that was the story. It was all about the viruses passed from primates to humans because they eat them, and obviously we weren't going to eat any bushmeat. And I think if anybody had shown any signs of illness, we would have been avoiding them pretty closely. Although we did interview a tribe, a village of forest pygmies, and we said, has anybody died of anything mysterious? And they're like, no, can't think of anything. And like, oh, hang on a minute, no, there was that village that was entirely wiped out a few weeks ago after they ate that dead gorilla. And we're like, oh, right, okay, thanks.
And everyone was bleeding from their ears.
They're all bleeding, they bled to death. It was a more horrible parting, but I won't tell you how they died.
Okay, good. And on that note, let's go to the Ukraine, where people die in other ways. So this is Bloomberg, where you're setting up the high-risk unit.
Yep.
Let's have a look at the clip first, and then we'll talk about it. So that figure rushing in from the right, that's you?
Yeah, that's one of my only cameos on screen. It's with my hands up. So, I chose that because an awful lot happened in a very, very short time. And I think probably the most dangerous element, if I'm honest, was going in a Ukrainian coal mine, which I wouldn't recommend to anyone at any point. But there were some things we did not especially well on that particular deployment, and other bits that worked very, very well. And I'll start with the things that didn't go well. And a lot of that was circumstantial in that this wasn't going to happen until the very last minute. So we kind of traveled in very, very quickly, doing a lot of things that I wouldn't, given the choice, have done. For example, crossing the front line between the Ukrainian positions and the rebel positions, which is 7 checkpoints, 4 Ukrainian, 3 separatist, and they close at night. And we actually traversed that after dark with a pledge that they would stay open, which was probably relying more on luck than on judgment than anything else. And they did. Things that I could influence there was how we approached those checkpoints. So dimming the headlights, interior lights on, profile of the people in the vehicle, so that for a soldier stood at that checkpoint, we look a certain way. And to sort of counterbalance that, I'd reference another journalist who was trying to come the other way, parked at the edge of one of the separatist checkpoints, headlights on full beam, shouting down to be let through, and we actually had to relay a message to that particular journalist that if they don't go back pretty sharpish, they're going to get shot. So, even in the things that you don't like and you wouldn't do out of choice, there were still those little things, those little bits of practice that you can influence. So I'd highlight that as one particular area. But that's really just to sort of show the rush in which we were doing things and that we had to do that at night. We had a very, very tight filming schedule. That also meant we didn't really get enough time on the ground to orientate ourselves, which, again, as a security advisor, I really dislike, because effectively you're flying blind. You can look on a map, you can talk to your fixer, you can talk to your driver, but you really want to be able to get a decent amount of time to assimilate information and make your judgments based on that, especially when you're making something slightly longer form, potentially. But we didn't get that. So just at the end there, where it cut off and the soldiers coming towards us, that's just ahead of a detention that we experienced there. And as Ryan Chilcott says there, we didn't really realise where we were at that point. I mean, we knew geographically, but we didn't know the security terrain, the human terrain. We didn't know who controlled that patch. We didn't know what their specific affiliations were, and we perhaps hadn't done the necessary liaison. So we ended up there slightly unprepared, actually. So that was not a good thing, and that's the end result, But what I would say is one of the things that we had been able to discuss was what you do in that kind of scenario. And that's where, having that plan in advance, you can really see it in practice. And effectively, our vehicle, as we were going in, there's those signifiers that Ryan references. So, first of all, it's deserted, and it's clearly a war zone, tons of amount of destruction. There's a single vehicle flying past. It doesn't look good. Oh, and there's gunfire as well. That's a pretty clear indicator something's going on. It's not a great place. So we say, right, let's do this pretty quickly. But there's always that one last piece to camera, right? Which is what he was doing, actually. And those words actually said, let's just do this one last piece to camera. Okay, let's go for it. Let's do it, and then let's go.
Vehicle, I've positioned that maybe 100 metres to my rear, facing the way I want to go, away with the driver, so that's all ready. That single lone vehicle you saw in the piece came flying round, and Ryan says to me, I think there was a guy looking at us outside that vehicle. Did you see it? And I said, no. And that then gave him the confidence to continue, which I think is also an error, because these things are a team effort, right? And if someone's having a gut instinct about something, you've got to action it. Probably a failure on my behalf, I didn't. And we stuck around. That same vehicle stopped about 150 to 200 metres away at the end of that road I think you can see on the screen. Now, he's holding an AK-47. It's got an effective range in by a trained shot of, let's say, 300 metres. Now, he's probably been only holding a rifle for about 2 weeks, but he's probably had a lot of practice as well. So I'm doing a very quick equation here. The vehicle's 100 metres away. He's about 200 metres away. Ryan's stuck down in that bridge, you know, where you saw him stumbling down. He's stuck down there. I don't want to expose him to that, so we go for the submissive approach. Rather than trying to make a run for it, we make a submissive approach. And also you can see just on the right of the screen, it's quite likely there's a trap coming around there that car could probably hop up and chase us, and I was right about that as well. So we're not running anywhere. So our immediate response is immediate submissiveness. You can see Ryan talks to him in the language. Journalist, we're going for the kind of slightly dim approach. You know, we don't know where we are. It's true. So, he comes over, has this conversation. The other effect that has is this guy's in a balaclava. We don't know him. We don't know what's happened there 4 hours before, 5 hours before. We don't know what's just happened to his mates. We don't know what's in that car. So immediately we're putting the fact that he's in control. And he is in control. And, don't try and contest that. You can just see me there. I move in front of the cameraman, completely submissive. He actually stops filming at that point, gives him a moment then to switch his cards, so we're not going to lose any footage, because we've got a pretty good idea what's coming next. He comes up, and actually what follows on from there is we are detained. That submissiveness pays off. We spend a substantial amount of time with them, with questioning varying from the hostile to the friendly. And it actually gives an opportunity to build that relationship as well. And they actually became our hosts and our guides later on in the filming. That's how these things work sometimes, right? And they were excellent guides. They knew their patch very, very well. So a little bit of serendipity there. But I wanted to put that in because I think there's, things don't always go brilliantly. And there are so many other pressures that affect filmmakers and journalists. And, we'd be naive to think that everything's always going to go perfectly and the perfect planning process always takes place. It doesn't. But, what we have to do as a team is identify where those key conversations take place, where if it does go horribly wrong, what do we do? And what I was saying earlier about never being entirely powerless, I think that's true. Even if you've got your hands up and the guy's pointing an AK-47, and that idea of doing something about it is also important. I also want to talk about something else within that film. I mean, we spoke about the post-traumatic stress as well. Within that, there was a lot of proximity to violence. There was a lot of proximity to death. It's everywhere. Even going through the airport, you saw the unexploded ordnance there. People put a wrong foot, and journalists have been killed there fairly frequently. Soldiers are getting killed there regularly, and you can't ignore it. And we were exposed to it in great proximity as well. And we had a car smash as well, the number one risk. Well, it actually happened. We actually had a bad car crash the night before. So within 24 hours, you've had a really intense experience from crossing these front lines, going into this area, going into the airport, being exposed to this violence, having the car crash, being exposed to everything else that goes with that, all the human suffering. It'd be wrong not to mention the impact that can have on an individual who is also exhausted and also trying to meet a deadline. And, there's going to come a point eventually where that reaches a boiling point. So I just wanted to put that together just to highlight those specific things that things don't always go perfectly. You do what you can during and afterwards. And, sometimes that can lead to great things as well.
Great. Okay, lovely. Let's open it up to questions. Has anyone got a question for this fine panel? Yes.
Hi. Whether it's guys in the jungle with machetes or gang members or soldiers in a war zone, how often does it come down to an exchange of money on the ground to make things work? Or is that a big no-no?
I'm just trying to recall if, I honestly don't think I've been in a situation where money's, no, I don't think it's ever been used to solve the problem, and in fact, I generally try and avoid it. I think it can lead to other problems as a rule. There may be situations where it's just a checkpoint guy that wants a bit of extra cash or something like that. If it's a really serious, you're being wrapped up by a government militia, probably best not to try that. If it's a checkpoint where a guy's getting a bit antsy and wants cigarette money, I would leave it to the fixer to maybe say, well, maybe it's $10 or something, I'm not sure there's probably a golden rule about not doing that, but I can't think of a case where that's been used.
I agree entirely. I think money's a huge corrupting factor, and when people are working for you as a journalist, whose job it is to get a story out there, which is generally for because there's something horribly wrong with the way the world is working, certainly in a lot of foreign affairs stuff. I think money is a really unhealthy corrupting factor, and people who are trying to get that story out for money, I would, as a guideline, I'd say steer well clear of. Because, if you can pay so much, someone else can pay a certain amount as well. And certainly if we look at what's happened in northern Syria over the past, since 2011, and the way that the kidnap trade, where moving into Syria was always quite a high-risk thing to do. But now journalists are commodities with an ultimate end value for a pretty nasty end customer. Excuse my prejudice on that. I think that's the supreme example of why we try and avoid it wherever you could. Yeah.
Ramita?
Same.
Yeah.
Same. Money, I don't think can ever get you out of real trouble, which is often ideological. Mm. And I think, what my colleagues say, it's so important that you are never associated with paying for a story, even if you're not paying for a story. At all costs, you must never pay out because you're getting a story and it can be construed in so many different ways.
Mm. Poisonous stuff.
Yeah.
Another question?
Lucky I don't have lots of it.
Yes, over there. Mike's coming from your right.
Beautiful. Thank you. 2 quick questions. First has to do with proxy servers, connecting your phone or computer to a proxy server. Does that help? Do you feel that that's a good backup? Second question has to do with intelligence gathering. You have a main security person who you work with, but then you also can work with UN people or your embassy, local fixers. And how can you share that information with your main security people and make sure that they don't feel like you're undermining them or making them look bad in front of their people?
Just briefly, proxy, normally, proxy servers can be very useful, obviously. If you don't try and if you're trying to hide where you are, is that what you mean when you're
hiding where you are, but also make sure that the government or other governments can know your movements? Yeah,
that's becoming increasingly important, and depending on where you are, more important possibly in the West than it is in some of the countries we go to as well. But I think, you've got to try and use all methods you can to try and be careful about how you communicate. But often what happens is you get to a certain point where it's down to a local phone card to ring the local person that you need to get on contact, and then have you made those arrangements, and how do you make those arrangements? It's not very high tech often. It's a matter of on the ground and making it work. Working with embassies and things, we generally try and avoid that. So we're doing a story with local people. We're not communicating or sharing with an embassy. They can see the story when it goes on air.
Yeah, I'd say with the communications, you can do an awful lot. If someone's going to target you, then they'll get hold of your information because it'll be a concerted effort over time and they'll succeed eventually. You can do an awful lot to make it extremely difficult, but a proxy server is one of many things. So I just say that there is no perfect solution on that particular one.
Okay. Another question. Yes.
Have you ever been in a situation where a driver or a fixer has actually jeopardised what you're trying to do And how do you go about planning for that if you haven't experienced it? Does that come into your planning at all?
Ramita?
No, I haven't. But I have a colleague who was sold by his fixer, by a man who he had been working with in Syria for 2 years. But apart from him, I think generally, I don't know, I've never really met, have you ever? I've never really met anybody who's been sold out by their fixer, because you generally, especially after a few years of doing this, you know who to trust. You know, you ask your colleagues who've been working with people for years, and your fixer is vital in your story. You know, a lot of my colleagues say your story is only ever as good as your fixer. You will only ever be as safe as they can make you safe in a lot of these circumstances where you're in their hands.
Yeah, they're so key. You know, you referenced earlier Guatemala, you know, the different perceptions of security. And, you know, in Ukraine, you know, I would perhaps have questions about what the fixer was saying to us there as well. Because it's such a key part of the relationship. You know, you do your background, you know, no one's perfect. But, you know, you've also got to allow a bit of time for them to learn about you. As long as in terms of someone being inherently bad, it's very, very rare.
Actually, sorry, I've just thought of something. So I was doing a story in the Sinai desert, and it was Bedouins who were smuggling, mostly Eritreans, across the Sinai into Israel. And some of these Eritreans were getting held in kidnap camps and tortured along the way. So we had a brilliant Egyptian fixer. I've worked with him several times now, but to get access to the Bedouins, we needed a Bedouin fixer. He blew $1,500 of the budget on lap dancers and booze. So yes, there have been instances where you were let down by fixers. Luckily, his wife threw him out of the house, and so he came crawling back, and we got the story. But yeah, stuff like that happens.
I think if you were going somewhere for the first time, and you know, as an independent or a freelancer, then you know, that's going to be one of the key relationships you need to build, and it would certainly be something to do an awful lot of homework on, because that person will probably be more important to you than any security advisor or anything like that. You know, they can be extremely good, and you know, a good fixer's worth their weight in gold, as is a good local driver.
I mean, obviously the process is, you know, you check with people who've worked with those fixers and that driver before. You make sure you've got at least half a dozen people, if you can, who've worked with them, who can give you their strengths and weaknesses, and any alerts should come up at that point. And if they've gone through that process. I mean, I'd say in some cases, or some countries actually, and I'm thinking here about China in particular, you can have nationalist sentiments that emerge in the way that the translator or the fixer may not have thought that the story you're doing is that going to be that sort of story. They could start to disagree with the approach, and that you can start to run into troubles that way. And that's something to be aware of, and if that does happen, then you need a backup. You need to get somebody else.
Have you always worked with fixers who know what you're doing, or have you sometimes gone in with a cover story and your fixer, you tell the cover story to your fixer, either for their protection or to facilitate what you're doing?
I think the fixers have always, they're so integral to what you're trying to achieve. I think all fixers have always known what we've been doing. I mean, we may have been less than completely honest with government minders that we've been given. In places like Egypt, before the revolution and things like that, but then that's part of the course, because they're trying to control what you're actually doing. But then there's ways around that.
Yeah,
give them a day off.
I think if you were to look at somewhere like China, for example, you know, it's possible that your fixer may also be, you know, working for someone else other than you.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, it might actually give you great access. I wouldn't write these things off, you know, straight away. But it's just something certainly to be aware of in certain operating environments, certain countries in this world. So, yeah, I mean, it could, in theory, happen. Don't write it off just because that's the case. You know, it might not matter that much. But it's certainly something to be aware of sometimes.
Yeah, in Iran, they are informing.
Yeah,
they
of course.
Have to.
And so there you might want to shelter some of what you're doing, but then, you know, that's a decision in that place and that time.
And Ramita, you talked about, earlier on, you talked about the advantage of looking Middle Eastern and looking local. Do you sometimes play it the other way in terms of playing dumb and British and not letting them understand that you can actually speak the language and do know what's going on?
Well, funnily enough, I just did a job for Channel 4 News, and it was about there are thousands of migrants that are being kidnapped in Europe by Afghan kidnap gangs. It's an extraordinary story, and I was in this wooded area between Greece and Macedonia, and Al Jazeera were there, and they were filming this. I was telling you about this earlier. They were filming this group of migrants receiving handouts from MSF, and I overheard what they were talking about. They were Afghan, and I understood them speaking Dari, and they were talking business. And they weren't a group of migrants, they were people traffickers. So I sidled up to them and, found out very quickly what was going on, and that was because I could understand the language. And up until that point, they had thought, well, I guess I look Greek, you see. They didn't think that I was Iranian or Afghan. So it has worked to my advantage. When I can understand the language, it's great.
Okay, another question. Yes?
I'm also curious to how gender...
Just hang on, let's get the mic up so everyone can hear.
First off, thanks so much for this panel. It's really interesting. But I'm really curious about how gender can work to your advantage or disadvantage within safety and within finding a story. And I kind of want to open it up to the whole panel. That's okay.
Well, I often get asked this question, and I can do all the stories that my male colleagues can do, but I've also got access to half the population in countries where they either won't speak to men, or it's very difficult for men to get access and to get honest answers, to get real answers. So I've only ever seen it as an advantage. It can be trickier where sexual violence is concerned. So we were a team of 2 women when we went to Papua New Guinea. It has really, really high rate of sexual assaults against women. I think it's over 80% of all women in Papua New Guinea have experienced sexual assault of some kind. Gang rape is frighteningly common there. So because of that, it probably would have been different. Ev, you've worked in Papua New Guinea, so we probably worked in very different ways. So we had 8 guys, 8 bodyguards, really, following us wherever we went from local tribes for our protection. And that's how I felt safe, and I wouldn't have felt safe any other way actually doing that story. So I'm aware of that, but there are things you can do like protection.
Yeah, I mean it is restrictive sometimes. I mean in many Middle Eastern countries, if you want to talk about things with women. You need to, as a man or a male team, you obviously need to think about that, but that's in the pre-planning stage, and you work out how you're going to do that, and what's the right team to send, and that comes down to conversations with the commissioning editors and the series editors and yourself and the fixer, and you work all that out, but it depends. Conversely, men in Papua New Guinea probably would have given Ramita a different answer to that situation than to me sitting down having a chat over a few beers with them, for example, where they might be more willing to sort of be more honest about it. It just really depends.
I remember one time, sorry.
The one place where, I've made specific provision for a gender difference before is Cairo during the riots in Tahrir Square, where there was a specific pattern of women being targeted for sexual violence. And that's where we looked at the security profile and what support we were giving to those women. That's the only time, and that's not, that's just because that is an actual risk. I certainly haven't seen any difference in the work that men and women can do. There's just sometimes a slight changes in the way it's done, and that's fine. It's just the world we live in, right?
Actually, I covered that story of women, of Egyptian women being systematically raped at protests. And we had to have 2 burly guys with me when we went into mob situations, like when we were near Tahrir Square and near the protests. And I wouldn't have wanted to do it any other way because women were being targeted. I didn't want to put myself.
I mean, I did work with women in that scenario who didn't want someone on their shoulder. And again, that's, it's an individual decision. But what we did do was have them circulating, let's say, in the proximity to where the front row is to me now. So at least you've got someone listening, someone close, even if, who's listening to the conversation of the crowd, what they're saying, what the crowd movement is around that person. So it doesn't interfere on their direct reporting, because some people just don't like a security advisor with them. They think it affects the intimacy of interviews or the way people relate to them, all of which can be true. But we just had to have something, just to have something there. And that's, so that's just one of the ways in which we can adjust the practice that, we do. It doesn't necessarily mean, I'm not 6 foot and I'm not muscly anyway, but, it's, if people don't like that, then you can have, you can make subtle adjustments.
I remember being in South Africa in the Oscar Peterson Memorial, and we were filming there with Oprah Winfrey, and she comes with a large group of people around her, some of whom are very large and American and quite aggressive, and all her mind, she has about 6 minders around her most of the time. And we were doing this piece with this little girl who was going to her leadership academy, and she was taking Oprah around the Oscar Peterson Memorial and explaining it. And we shot the piece, and then they sort of headed back to their cars. And there are lots and lots of hawkers around the Oscar Peterson Memorial. They've all got these, these little bits. And of course, they wanted Oprah to buy something. They wanted her to, buy anything. And so they were trying to get to her get her to buy stuff. And there was the American minders, and then there were the local South African security as well. And the local South African security got how to deal with these guys, but the American minders didn't get it, and the testosterone levels just started to go up and up, and these big, marine types were sort of really starting to, their faces were getting set, and the hawkers were getting angry as well, and it was just, the whole situation was really getting quite dangerous. And our South African producer, Kholiswa Sitoli, was about 8.5 months pregnant at the time. And she saw what was going on, and she just waded right into the middle of it and said, boys, just settle down. And she just diffused all this tension. And so having an 8.5-month pregnant woman is sometimes quite useful for diffusing those testosterone moments.
Yeah, and I'd definitely say that about the security industry as a whole, actually. It's, especially working with the media and with filmmakers, it's such a specialist area. And the only way to be, you come out of any background, you've got to learn it, and that takes some time. So if you ever are working with security advisors, you've got to allow the time to educate them about what you're doing and how you want to work. Because depending on their level of experience and your relationship with them, that might take some time. It's horses for courses. We bring a certain suite of skills and experience. You guys often bring quite similar ones, but also a whole raft of new ones as well. And, media working with security is still quite an immature thing, funnily enough. It's still developing. It's very interesting.
Okay, one last question. One last great question from someone. Who's going to... Yes? Wait for the mic. There we go.
How do your families cope with you working in the danger zone?
My wife has known that I've always done it. For me personally, this is what I do, and I never pretended that wouldn't be. We've just mind you, we have now got a 1-year-old baby, and so I probably do think about it differently. There's probably things that I would think about more deeply about. Really, do I want to be in that situation now? I think it evolves, and I think also, I don't want to say it's a numbers game. It's not that. It's almost like I think you just get a sense for when maybe you don't want to do that same thing again, in a way. So I think it evolves, and I think it's good to keep thinking about it like that. But no, I'm not stopped from doing it yet.
Ramita?
My mum nags me quite a lot. But I try to reassure her that I don't take crazy risks. I don't. Stuff like that happens, but it's rare. You know, I really...
She sees it on telly, though.
She does always on film.
I thought you were in Greece.
But, you know, I try to reassure her that I don't do crazy stuff. You know, I don't want to get killed. I don't want to put my team in danger. I don't want to put locals in danger. And it's not worth it. It's not worth it. You know, the most important thing is your safety and everyone else's safety.
Yeah, I just came from the Philippines, and a very good example. I was with, we were told that there was a particular thing we should go and film. It was an interesting, a guy was doing a thing we wanted to film. It was a 45-minute walk from the village, and the guy I was with, the local fixer, said basically we shouldn't do that because there's basically armed communist rebels have started to get active in the area. They probably wouldn't. They'd probably, you know, you'd see you as money. They'd kidnap you, that sort of thing. And I was with a guy that was working with me who was very, very keen to go. And I just remember thinking then, you know, there was absolutely no way with that local information that I was going to do that 45-minute walk. And yet I could see in him, whether he was trying to prove it to himself or to me, that he would go and do it. And I thought, wow, you know, this is one of those situations where you... And I was just... And I don't know, I was trying to assess, is this because of the baby? Or was this because or was it just because... I don't know what it was, but it was just on that information, I wasn't going down there. But I think it's important that we try and teach people we work with that some things aren't just worth it.
It's only telly. It's not worth dying for.
Exactly.
Oh. I was just about to wrap it up as it happens. So thank you very much to my panel.